It began with subtle changes. My wife, Evelyn, and I had been married for 15 years, our life comfortable and steady. The routines of suburban life rolled on like clockwork. But over the past few months, her laughter seemed forced, her eyes distant. I dismissed it as the weight of her demanding career as an event planner. Until the night she came home late from a client meeting, the scent of cologne, too sharp and unfamiliar, clung to her clothes. Our family driver, Hector, had been with us for a decade. A stoic, loyal man who never overstepped, never asked questions. He was practically part of the family, chauffeuring our kids to school, Evelyn to work, and me to the occasional meeting. Hector was there when we first bought our home, when the kids were born, and through countless family milestones. He even knew Evelyn's coffee order by heart. One fateful night, while packing for a business trip, Evelyn's mood felt off. She was unusually cheerful, her voice laced with a strange enthusiasm. I was about to leave early the next morning for a conference 2 states away, but something gnawed at me. Her demeanor was too bright, too eager. It wasn't until I overheard her muffled conversation on the phone, "Tomorrow will be perfect. He'll be gone all weekend," that the pieces clicked into place. I canceled my trip without telling her and spent the night wide awake, my thoughts spiraling into dark possibilities. Could Evelyn, my steadfast wife, be cheating? And if so, with whom? The next morning, I pretended to leave for the trip, wheeling my suitcase out to my car with a cheerful wave. But instead of heading to the airport, I drove around the corner, parked, and quietly made my way back to the house. I stationed myself in a rented car, equipped with binoculars and a laptop, ready to keep watch. Hours passed before Evelyn finally left the house. Dressed in a form-fitting dress I'd never seen before, she walked out with a confidence that sent shivers down my spine. And there was Hector, holding the car door open for her. As they drove off, I tailed them, keeping a careful distance. Their destination chilled me to the bone, a luxury boutique hotel downtown. Watching from across the street, I saw them exit the car together, Evelyn's hand brushing his arm as they entered through the grand doors. The knot in my stomach tightened. But it wasn't just an affair. As I hacked into our shared financial accounts that night, my suspicions deepened. Unexplained withdrawals, odd transactions, and a sizable sum wired to a mysterious account. I realized this was no mere fling. Evelyn and Hector were planning something far more sinister. The hotel lobby was buzzing with the kind of detached elegance that cloaked secrets in plain sight. From my rented car, I watched Evelyn and Hector weave through the well-dressed crowd. She laughed at something he said, the sound carrying across the street like a taunt. My breath hitched as Hector placed his hand on her lower back, guiding her through the ornate, revolving doors. For a moment, I felt the sting of betrayal pierce through my disbelief. How could she, and with Hector, our trusted driver of all people? The rage simmered beneath my skin, but I forced myself to stay calm. Confrontation wasn't the answer. Not yet. I needed proof, something undeniable. That night, I drove back home, my mind racing. I set up a hidden camera system in the house, covering every room except the kids' bedrooms. I didn't know how deep this rabbit hole went, but I wasn't taking any chances. Then, I poured through our bank statements, phone bills, and emails. Patterns emerged like jagged pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Hector's number appeared too often in Evelyn's call history. The timestamps aligned with moments she'd claimed to be stuck at late-night meetings or client events. And the bank transactions? There was a joint account I'd never known about, opened months ago under an alias. The balance was staggering, nearly $50,000. My chest tightened. This wasn't just an affair. They were planning something big. A plan that required money. My money. I needed answers, but I also needed to outmaneuver them. If I confronted Evelyn now, she'd either deny everything or manipulate the narrative. So, I kept my mask of ignorance firmly in place. The next day, I returned from my trip as planned. Evelyn greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I hugged her, inhaling the faint trace of unfamiliar cologne still lingering on her clothes. My hands trembled as I squeezed her shoulders, but I plastered on a grin, pretending everything was fine. That evening, I casually asked Hector to drive me to a nearby mechanic to pick up my car. In the rearview mirror, his expression didn't falter, but I caught the faintest flicker of tension in his jaw. "You've been with us a long time, Hector," I said, leaning forward. "Yes, sir," he replied, his tone even. 10 years now, and you've been good to us. Always reliable." "Thank you, sir." I paused, studying his reaction. "Evelyn tells me you've been working late for her recently, driving her to these client events." "Yes, sir. Mrs. Evelyn works hard. I try to make things easier for her." His calm response sent a chill down my spine. If he was rattled, he didn't show it, but I knew better. The man I trusted with my family had been plotting behind my back, and his composure only solidified my resolve to uncover everything. When I got home, I reviewed the footage from the hidden cameras. Evelyn spent most of the day in her office, but later, she paced the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was hushed, but the microphone caught fragments of the conversation. "He's suspicious. Be careful. The transfer is almost complete. I'll handle the rest." The bile rose in my throat. My wife and the man I trusted most were colluding to rob me blind. But for what? They had the money. Why not leave now? The pieces didn't fit, until I caught a crucial detail on the footage later that night. Evelyn unlocked a hidden drawer in her desk and retrieved a folder. In it were copies of my business documents, bank accounts, and identification. They weren't just stealing money. They were setting me up. For what? I didn't know yet. But the implications were damning. I stayed up until dawn, combing through the recordings and cross-referencing the data I'd found. Hector's past suddenly became relevant. Though his references had checked out when we hired him, a deeper search revealed a criminal record, a stint in prison for fraud a decade ago. Evelyn must have known. Did she hire him intentionally for this? By morning, my rage had hardened into cold determination. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to make sure they paid for what they were planning. But first, I needed to know every detail of their scheme. The following morning, Evelyn left for her usual yoga session. The serene image of her slipping on leggings and tossing a towel over her shoulder was almost laughable in its hypocrisy. Behind the facade of domestic bliss, she was orchestrating a betrayal so calculated it could destroy everything we'd built. As the door clicked shut, I sprang into action. I started with Hector. If Evelyn was the mastermind, Hector was her accomplice, the loyal executor of her plans. I needed leverage against him, something to break their partnership wide open. Using the GPS tracker I discreetly placed on his car, I followed him to a nondescript diner on the outskirts of town. From the corner booth, I watched as he slid into a seat across from a wiry man in a leather jacket. The two spoke in hushed tones, but my phone's directional microphone captured enough. "He'll be out of the picture soon," Hector said, his voice low. "When it's done, we split everything." The man nodded. "You're sure she's on board?" Hector smirked. "Evelyn's the one who set it up. She's got it all mapped out. The accounts, the timeline, even the alibi." My chest tightened. Alibi. They weren't just stealing money. They were framing me for something criminal. Whatever it was, I couldn't wait for their next move. I needed to dismantle their plan before it unfolded. Back at home, Evelyn was seated at the kitchen island, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. Her relaxed demeanor was infuriating, but I played my part. "How was yoga?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "Great," she replied, flashing me a smile. "Just what I needed after a long week." I nodded, pretending to be engrossed in the morning paper while studying her from the corner of my eye. Her phone buzzed, and her fingers danced across the screen. The light on her face changed as she switched apps, and I caught a glimpse of a text exchange. "Hector, meeting at 6. Usual spot. Ready to move forward?" Evelyn, "Yes. It's all set. He'll never see it coming." I excused myself to the garage, my heart pounding. At least now I had a timeline. 6 p.m. at their usual spot. But what would I find? A strategy meeting? A final exchange of stolen funds? Whatever it was, I couldn't miss it. The rest of the day passed like a fog, every minute dragging as I waited for the clock to strike 6. Evelyn left the house around 5:30, casually dressed, claiming she had to run errands. I watched her pull out of the driveway, then followed at a safe distance. Her car led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Tucked between two crumbling buildings, the place was dark, save for a faint glow spilling from the cracked windows. I parked a block away and approached on foot, careful to stay in the shadows. My heart raced as I peered through a broken window. Inside, Evelyn and Hector were hunched over a table, papers spread out before them. I strained to hear their conversation. "It's all here," Evelyn said, tapping the papers. "The fake accounts, the forged signatures. When the audit points to him, the police will do the rest." "And the offshore transfer?" Hector asked. "Already in motion. By the time they figure it out, we'll be untouchable." Hector chuckled. "Never thought I'd pull something this big. You're one hell of a partner." Evelyn smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I once knew. It was cold, calculating. Mike had it coming. He's too trusting, too predictable. It's almost too easy. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. The woman I loved, the mother of my children, saw me as nothing more than an obstacle, a fool to be exploited. I clenched my fists, the urge to storm in and confront them nearly overwhelming. But I held back. This wasn't the moment. I needed more. Evidence that would shatter their plans and expose them for what they truly were. I slipped away into the night, my mind racing. I had a recording of their conversation, but it wasn't enough to implicate them fully. They could spin it, claim it was hypothetical or out of context. I needed something undeniable, something that would make their betrayal impossible to deny. The next step was clear. If they were going to frame me, I'd turn the tables. Whatever they were planning, I'd make sure it backfired spectacularly. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, Evelyn's words replayed in my mind. "It's almost too easy." I stared at the ceiling, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. I couldn't afford to lose focus now. They thought they had me cornered, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. By morning, I had a plan. I called in sick to work, using the time to prepare for the next phase. The evidence I'd collected so far was damning, but I needed to bait them into revealing the full scope of their operation. Whatever they were planning, I would make sure it imploded in their faces. First, I contacted a private investigator, someone outside the local police force. His name was Nick, a grizzled ex-detective who had no patience for niceties, but a sharp instinct for sniffing out fraud. I handed him copies of the financial records, the recorded conversations, and the timeline I'd pieced together. He listened intently, nodding as I laid out the details. "They're setting you up for a financial crime," he said, leaning back in his chair. "If they're tying this to your accounts, they'll need a paper trail that points directly to you. Can you dig deeper?" I asked. "Find the connections, track the offshore transfers?" Nick smirked. "Already on it. But you're gonna need more than just paper to sink them. Get them in the act. Record everything." That evening, I returned home to find Evelyn in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. The smell of roasted chicken wafted through the air, but it turned my stomach. She turned to me with a smile, the perfect image of a loving wife. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet. "Long," I replied, feigning exhaustion. "Glad to be home." She came over and kissed my cheek, and for a moment, I almost believed it was real. But the memory of her plotting in that warehouse crushed any flicker of sentiment. She was a stranger in our home, playing a role to keep her cover intact. After dinner, I waited until she was asleep, then retrieved her phone from her purse. Unlocking it with the code I'd memorized weeks ago, I scrolled through her messages. One thread caught my attention, a series of exchanges with Hector. The latest message sent chills down my spine. "Hector, tomorrow night. Final phase. You sure everything's ready?" Evelyn, "Yes. He won't know what hit him. Tomorrow." Whatever they were planning was imminent. My pulse quickened as I copied the conversation and sent it to my secure cloud. I returned the phone to her bag, my mind racing. The next day, I shadowed Hector. Using the tracker, I followed him as he made his rounds. In the afternoon, he stopped at a storage unit on the outskirts of town. Watching from a distance, I saw him load a duffel bag into the trunk of his car. It was black, bulky, and too heavy to be harmless. What was in the bag? Cash? Weapons? Evidence they planned to plant? I tailed him to another location, a quiet suburban street. He parked outside a house, knocked on the door, and handed the bag to a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek. The man looked around nervously before disappearing inside. I stayed put, taking photos from my car. Hector left minutes later, unaware he was being watched. Whatever was in that bag was critical to their plan, and I needed to figure out how it fit into the bigger picture. Later that evening, Evelyn announced she'd be working late again. "Just wrapping up a few loose ends for a client," she said, grabbing her keys. I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Don't stay out too late." She smiled, but there was an edge of nervousness in her expression. It was subtle, but I caught it. She knew the stakes were high. As soon as she left, I followed her. She drove straight to the same warehouse where I'd seen her and Hector before. This time, I didn't keep my distance. I parked close enough to catch their voices through my microphone. "We plant the evidence tonight," Hector was saying. "By morning, everything points to him." "And the money?" Evelyn asked. "Transferred offshore. We'll be long gone before he can figure it out." I gritted my teeth as the full picture became clear. They weren't just framing me for financial fraud. They were setting me up for embezzlement or worse. They wanted me disgraced, broke, and likely imprisoned. But they'd underestimated me. The walls were closing in, but I wasn't going to let them win. As I sat in my car outside the warehouse, the weight of their plan pressed down on me. Evelyn and Hector were too confident, too assured that I'd fall neatly into the trap they'd constructed. Little did they know, I was about to turn the tables. I called Nick, the private investigator, and filled him in on the latest developments. "They're moving tonight," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "They're planting something to frame me, but I don't know where or what." Nick's voice crackled through the receiver. "Don't act rash. We'll catch them in the act, but you need to keep them feeling secure. They're less careful when they think they're winning." As much as I wanted to storm into the warehouse and confront them, I heeded his advice. There was too much at stake to let my anger take over. Instead, I drove back home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. By the time I arrived, Evelyn was already home, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. She looked up as I walked in, her smile almost disarming. "You're home early." I forced a laugh. Traffic was light. She patted the spot next to her, but I waved her off, pretending to head to bed early. "Long day," I mumbled. Behind the closed door of our bedroom, I checked the footage from the hidden cameras I'd set up. It didn't take long to find Evelyn's next move. While I was gone earlier, she'd rummaged through my office. Her hands were quick, deliberate, as she sifted through my desk drawers. When she pulled out one of my old checkbooks, I felt my stomach drop. She flipped through the pages, extracting several blank checks before snapping a photo of my signature from a separate document. I knew exactly what she was doing. With those checks and my forged signature, she could make it look like I'd siphoned money into the secret accounts they'd set up. The proof would be damning, and by the time I could prove otherwise, the damage would already be done. The next morning, Evelyn was gone before I woke up. Her note on the kitchen counter read, "Had to leave early. Don't wait up tonight." I smirked bitterly. "Don't worry, I won't." After she left, I met Nick at a coffee shop. He placed a manila envelope on the table between us. "Here's the dirt you wanted," he said, his eyes sharp. "That storage unit Hector stopped at? It's leased under his alias, and guess what? It's full of cash. A lot of it." My heart raced. "The stolen funds?" Nick nodded. "Every dime they transferred offshore came through that unit first. If we act fast, we can intercept the transfer before it's too late. But we'll need something more to nail them both." I flipped through the photos he'd provided. Hector and Evelyn meeting in secret, the duffel bag exchange, the account details. Everything was falling into place. But it wasn't enough. I needed to catch them red-handed. "Tonight," I said. "They'll be planting the evidence tonight. That's when we make our move." Nick leaned forward, his expression serious. "You sure you're ready for this? If we mess up, they'll bolt and you'll take the fall." "I'm ready," I said, my jaw tight. "I'm not giving them the satisfaction of ruining me." By evening, I was in position. Nick had set up outside the warehouse with a camera, while I waited at home, playing the role of the oblivious husband. As expected, Evelyn slipped out again, her movements hurried. I followed at a distance, watching as she drove straight to Hector's apartment. They emerged minutes later, carrying a briefcase and a folder. I knew without a doubt that those documents were the final pieces of their trap. Nick and I tailed them to an office building downtown. It was late, but the lights on the third floor were still on. Evelyn and Hector entered through a side door, their silhouettes disappearing into the dimly lit hallway. Nick motioned for me to follow, but I shook my head. Not yet. Let them think they're safe. We waited in the stairwell as muffled voices filtered through the walls. Evelyn and Hector were in the office, their tones urgent. "Leave it here," Hector said. "The auditors will find it in the morning." "And when they do," Evelyn added, her voice laced with satisfaction, "Mike's life will fall apart." The rage in my chest burned hotter, but I stayed put. Nick's camera recorded everything, each word a nail in their coffin. When they left the building, I stepped into the office. There, on the desk, was the folder they'd planted. Inside were forged documents, fake transactions, and just enough evidence to implicate me. But now, it was my evidence. I photographed everything, careful not to disturb the setup. The noose was tightening around Evelyn and Hector, but it wasn't around my neck anymore. The tension in the air was palpable as I drove home, my mind racing. The evidence I'd gathered so far was enough to dismantle Evelyn and Hector's plan, but I wasn't ready to strike just yet. I needed to orchestrate the perfect moment, one where their entire scheme would come crashing down, leaving no room for escape. That evening, Evelyn returned home, her usual calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. She kissed me on the cheek as if everything was normal, as if she hadn't just planted the tools to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. The audacity of her duplicity sent a fresh wave of anger through me, but I swallowed it down. The time for confrontation was drawing near. We had dinner together, making small talk about mundane topics. She asked about my day, and I painted a picture of routine monotony, playing the part of the oblivious husband. Inside, I was anything but. I was counting down the hours until their plan would unravel. Late that night, as Evelyn slept soundly beside me, I texted Nick. They planted the evidence. It's all set. Are you ready for tomorrow? Nick, ready. You'll get your show. The next morning, Evelyn left the house early again. Big day, she said, her smile warm but her eyes distant. I'll be home late. I nodded, watching her leave. The moment the door closed behind her, I sprang into action. The fake evidence she and Hector had planted was still fresh in the office where I'd found it. Nick and I had everything set up to make sure they wouldn't just face suspicion, they'd face justice. By noon, I was parked across from the office building where Evelyn and Hector had been the night before. I stayed out of sight as a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Hector stepped out, dressed sharply, a briefcase in hand. He entered the building without looking back. Minutes later, Evelyn arrived, walking with the same air of confidence that had once captivated me. I clenched my jaw and dialed Nick's number. "They're in," I said. "Perfect. Cameras are rolling," Nick replied. "They'll never see it coming." Inside, Nick's team of investigators, posing as building security, had already infiltrated the office and set up hidden cameras. Evelyn and Hector thought they were meeting alone to finalize their plans, but their every move was being recorded. I switched on the live feed Nick had sent to my phone. The video displayed Evelyn and Hector sitting in the office, their voices crisp and clear over the audio. "Audit report will be delivered to the board by the end of the day," Evelyn was saying, her voice firm. "Once they trace the money, Mike will look like the mastermind. No one will believe a mechanic figured this out." Hector chuckled. "Poor guy. He still has no idea. By the time the cops come knocking, we'll be sipping cocktails on a beach." I gritted my teeth as they laughed. Their mockery of my trust only fueled my determination. Nick's team was already prepared to share the feed with authorities, but I had one final move to make before the walls closed in. At 1:30 p.m., I walked into the office. The receptionist gave me a puzzled look as I strode past her desk, heading straight for the room where Evelyn and Hector were scheming. I pushed open the door without knocking. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock, her smile faltering. "Mike, what are you doing here?" I didn't answer. Instead, I set my phone on the table, the live feed from Nick's cameras playing in real time. Hector's face turned pale as he saw himself on screen, his laughter from moments ago echoing back at him. You were saying something about cocktails on a beach? I said, my voice low and steady. Evelyn's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Hector stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This isn't what it looks like, he stammered. Save it, I snapped. Everything you've done is recorded. Every lie, every forged document, every word. It's over. Evelyn's facade crumbled, panic flashing across her face. Mike, please. Let me explain. Explain? I barked, cutting her off. Explain how you were going to steal everything I've worked for? How you were going to frame me and run off with him? Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. The woman standing before me wasn't the person I'd built a life with. She was a stranger who had planned to ruin me. The door behind me opened, and Nick entered, flanked by 2 officers. Evelyn Carter, Hector Ramirez, you're under arrest, one of them said, stepping forward. Evelyn gasped, clutching the edge of the table for support. Mike, you don't have to do this, she pleaded. You did this, I said coldly, stepping aside as the officers moved in. And now you'll pay for it. As they were handcuffed and led out, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The nightmare was over, but the damage was done. The life I thought I had was gone, replaced by a hollow victory. The aftermath was surreal. Watching Evelyn and Hector being taken away in handcuffs should have filled me with a sense of triumph, but all I felt was a gnawing emptiness. This wasn't just the end of their scheme. It was the end of everything I thought I knew about my life. Nick stayed with me as the officers wrapped up their statements. They collected the folder of forged evidence from the office, the surveillance footage, and the financial records Nick had uncovered. Together, it painted a devastatingly clear picture of Evelyn and Hector's plan to rob me blind, frame me for embezzlement, and vanish with my hard-earned money. When the last officer left, Nick leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You okay? He asked. I shrugged, staring out the window at the city below. I don't know. I should feel relieved, right? But all I can think about is how easily they fooled me. Nick nodded, his gruff voice surprisingly gentle. You trusted them. That's not a weakness, Mike. That's what decent people do. They abused it. That's on them, not you. I nodded, though the words offered little comfort. My marriage, my home, and the trust I'd placed in Hector had all been burned to the ground. And for what? Greed? Power? I wasn't sure if I'd ever get the answers I needed. The fallout came quickly. Evelyn and Hector's arrests made headlines. The details of their crimes splashed across local news. It turned out Hector's past was even darker than I'd uncovered. He'd been involved in a string of similar cons years ago, always targeting vulnerable employers. Evelyn, it seemed, was his most ambitious partner to date. I kept my distance as the legal proceedings unfolded. Prosecutors assured me the evidence against them was airtight. Hector took a plea deal, offering a full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence. Evelyn, however, fought tooth and nail, insisting she'd been manipulated by Hector. But the paper trail and recordings painted a different picture, one of cold, calculated betrayal. The trial dragged on for months, but I refused to attend. The thought of seeing Evelyn again, of hearing her excuses and watching her try to save herself, was too much. Instead, I focused on rebuilding the pieces of my life she hadn't managed to destroy. One evening, weeks after the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, I found myself standing in the backyard, staring at the garden Evelyn had once loved. The house was quiet now, almost too quiet. The kids were away at college, and for the first time in years, I was alone. A knock at the door broke the silence. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Nick standing there, holding a brown envelope. Thought you'd want to see this, he said, handing it over. Inside was a series of financial documents, newly filed. They outlined a restitution plan, money recovered from the offshore accounts Hector and Evelyn had set up, as well as assets seized during the investigation. The sum wasn't small. Nearly every penny they'd stolen was being returned to me. They couldn't spend it fast enough, Nick said with a smirk. Guess they weren't as smart as they thought. I chuckled bitterly. No, I guess not. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. Take care of yourself, Mike. You deserve it. After Nick left, I sat on the couch, staring at the envelope. The money would help, sure, but it couldn't undo the damage. It couldn't restore the years of trust or the life I'd built with Evelyn. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let her betrayal define me. It wouldn't be easy, but I had to move forward, for myself, for my kids, and for the life I still had ahead of me. Months turned into a year, and slowly, the scars began to heal. I sold the house, moved to a smaller place closer to the city, and threw myself into work. My kids visited often, their support a constant reminder that some bonds couldn't be broken. I even started dating again, a terrifying, exhilarating leap back into the unknown. As for Evelyn and Hector, they faded into the background of my life. Evelyn was sentenced to 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. Hector's deal landed him a shorter sentence, but he wouldn't see freedom for at least 8 years. They were out of my life, and that was all that mattered. One day, while cleaning out old boxes, I found a photo of Evelyn and me from years ago. We were smiling, carefree, completely unaware of what the future held. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, but then I placed the photo back in the box and shut the lid. The past was behind me now. My future was mine to shape, free from lies, free from betrayal. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to begin again.